Before I can get into my analysis of The Wall as the archetype for the modern concept album, it's important to look at some definitions regarding the term concept album. A quick Google search results in a short definition that reads as a rock album featuring a cycle of songs expressing a particular theme or idea. It's often thought that the rock genre is the originator of the format, as Rick Wakeman, keyboardist for Yes, states that Woody Guthrie's Dust Bowl Ballads, released back in 1940, was the original concept album. The songs on Dust Bowl Ballads are semi-autobiographical, chronicling Guthrie's experience during the Dust Bowl era, where Guthrie witnessed the economic hardship that many migrant workers faced in California. Like many of Guthrie's later recordings, these songs contain an element of social activism. Wakeman's statement suggests that an early format of the concept album meant it was one that related to real life. It was one that was rooted in the struggles and hardships of everyday people. Rick Wakeman also cites several bands in releasing proto-concept albums, which eventually led to the invention of progressive rock and rock opera. These bands were The Who, the Beach Boys, and the Kinks, just to name a couple of them. To cite progressive rock and rock opera means that Rick Wakeman is incredibly knowledgeable on the area of the concept album. No surprise, seeing as he released one himself, 1984, named after the dystopian George Orwell tale. To explain further, it's also important to understand what exactly progressive rock and rock opera mean to the concept album genre. Progressive rock is defined as a style of rock music popular especially in the 1970s and characterized by classical influences, the use of keyboard instruments, and lengthy compositions, while rock opera is a collection of rock music songs with lyrics that relate to a common story. Progressive rock and rock opera already differ from our traditional songs. One, they last much longer, as shown with many progressive rock tracks created by Yes, and with rock opera often lasting more than an hour long, telling a long narrative. Progressive rock and rock opera help us shape our own definition of the concept album. From what we can see right now, the concept album relies on narrative extensively, whether this narrative is through a single theme that can be instrumental, compositional, or lyrical. Songs can have their own stories that may not seem like they relate to other songs, but they must add to the overarching narrative of the album to be considered a concept album. One song about the Dust Bowl does not make an entire song a concept album, but the fact that this song lends a different element to the story. The increased use of the concept album format in the 1970s by progressive rock bands suggests that there is an appeal to the format, not only to artists but also to the listeners. So it begs the question, what is so appealing about a concept album? Why listen to it versus other forms of music that are more aesthetically pleasing at times? Using an internet chat board as a resource for gauging interesting concept albums, I stumbled upon a subreddit regarding some popular concept albums. One Reddit user comments on Kendrick Lamar's Good Kid, Mad City and To Pimp a Butterfly as concept albums and why he enjoys them, stating that Good Kid, Mad City and To Pimp a Butterfly are two of the most seminal concept albums of this generation or any. They both follow very clear storylines, they are heroes and villains, the characters grow as the album progresses, there are clear morals to be learned, victories to be attained, and losses that have to be dealt with. This is not to mention that they are two of the most musically cohesive and tight albums that you have the pleasure of listening to. We can see now that a third point of interest for those who listen to concept albums is the fact that these albums are incredibly well made, and their narrative is one that can be followed along clearly. This narrative is of interest in that it relates to real life for the listener, something that many albums and many songs are trapped in this state of lack of progress. We only hear the song, there is no real beginning or end for the speaker. Here, though, with Kendrick Lamar's albums, we see characters, we see progression, and we see conclusion as well. Now that we've begun to hash out what the concept album is from the artist side, we should begin looking at how does it invite audience participation, or in some cases, reject it, putting up a wall between us. To do so, we will be looking at linguistic theorist Marshall McLuhan talking about hot. Starting with hot media is that which engages one sense completely. It demands little interaction from the user because it spoon feeds the content. Typically, the content of hot media is restricted to what the source offers at that specific time. Examples of hot media include radio and film because they engage one sense of the user to an extent that although the user's attention is focused on the content, their participation is minimal. On the other side, cool media generally uses low-definition media that engages several senses less completely in that it demands a great deal of interaction on the part of the audience. Audiences then participate more because they are required to perceive the gaps in the content themselves. The user must be familiar with genre conventions in order to fully understand the medium. Examples are TV, phone conversations, and comic books, along with written narratives. From what we know about music and from the definition of hot and cool media, it's easy to say that music is hot media. All you really have to do is sit back and relax as you enjoy the music from your radio. However, concept albums show us that there is a casual listening, but there is also a deeper listening, one that, like a book, you have to sit there and really pay attention to if you want to understand the full story. Now, we can draw our own conclusions regarding concept albums using Marshall McLuhan's theory. However, Pink Floyd, especially members such as Roger Waters, have been very clear about their intent in creating concept albums, especially from an interview he had with BBC regarding The Wall and the inspiration for it.
I asked Roger referred to the origination of the concept of The Wall. Just where did the idea come from?
Well, the idea for The Wall came from 10 years of touring with rock shows, I think. Particularly the last few years when in 75 and in 77 we were playing to very large audiences, some of whom were our old audience who'd come to hear what we wanted to play, but most of whom were only there for the beer in big stadiums, and consequently it became rather an alienating experience doing the shows. And I became very conscious of a wall between us and our audience. And so this record started out as being an expression of those feelings.
But it goes, I think, a little bit deeper than that, because the record actually seems to start at the beginning of the character's life.
The story has been developed considerably since then. This was 2 years ago. I started to write it. And now it's partly about a show situation, a live show situation. In fact, the album starts off in a live show. And then it flashes back and traces a story of a character, if you like, of Pink himself, whoever he may be. But initially it was just stemmed from shows being